graphic is sort of a comparison between the number of soldiers that served in the three major conflicts of the 20th century. In World War II, 13 million Americans served. In Vietnam, 3 million. And in the war in Iraq, the war against terror in Iraq, 1,400,000 served. But the longest lasting sort of cultural impact was from Vietnam, I would argue. And to look at the war in Vietnam, I think we started last lecture talking about how we got involved. It was Kennedy that really got us involved in the war, and he was a firm believer in the domino theory. He was determined to stop the spread of communism in Asia, and he was going to stop it at Vietnam. So he had many press conferences where he talked about what we were going to do to stop the communists in Vietnam. But here was the problem. The president of Vietnam was insanely unpopular with the South Vietnamese people because his government was overtly corrupt, and everybody knew it. Because if anyone criticized his government, they were arrested. He filled the government positions with these were people who were not experts. They were just friends and family who were getting a government paycheck, not serving the people very well. He was a Catholic, which is no problem, but in a country that is 95% Buddhist, to force everyone to obey Catholic laws made everybody angry. And this is to protest those laws. This is a Buddhist monk who has lit himself on fire in one of the Seoul's, or not Seoul, in one of the big city's main squares. Plus, he began to relocate farmers who were peasants into other areas, forcing them to leave their farms. So he was insanely unpopular. Finally, the United States knew that in order to move South Vietnam, they thought in order to move South Vietnam forward, they would have to get rid of Diem. So they actually had a coup, an overthrow of the president, which was approved by the CIA, the United States. Unfortunately, we didn't know they were going to kill him, and they did. The South Vietnamese army arrested him and killed him. Robert McNamara was Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, and then later he was also Secretary of Defense for Lyndon Johnson. He crafted our policy in response to communism in Vietnam. He used to work for General Motors and came to work for the president. He was going to do a few things. First of all, he was going to modernize the military. He was going to push for direct involvement in Vietnam. And he was going to do that with this modern army that was supposed to just roll over these peasants who were fighting for the North Vietnamese. Kennedy is assassinated, and Lyndon Johnson takes over the Vietnam policy. The new government in South Vietnam was just as unpopular and just as unsuccessful as the old government of Diem. So Johnson has a choice to make. In the South, the communist guerrillas, or the freedom fighters in the South, were called the Viet Cong. They were trained in the North. They were fighting to overthrow the government in the South that we were supporting, even though it was insanely unpopular. They were getting help from the communists in the North. But they were also, because they were bringing things like education and medicine to these remote small villages, they were gaining more territory of influence, and they were gaining more followers. In order to commit heavily into Vietnam, the Vietnamese, or Johnson, needed to have a sort of an event that happened. For us, in the War on Terror, it was 9/11, and for Johnson, it was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin is, if you see on the map, a little area off the coast of communist Vietnam. And Johnson told the country that there was a North Vietnamese torpedo boat, and it had attacked U.S. naval ships. Here's a painting of supposedly the incident. Details were real fuzzy, unclear. A lot of people, especially congressmen, believe that it never really happened at all. But he went before the country, said it did happen, and he went before the country and said, look, in order to stop these terrorists, in order to stop these communists from spreading, you have to give me power to fight them wherever I need to fight them. And people were frightened of communism, so they gave him the power. They passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in Congress, and it said that the president, Lyndon Johnson, had any power he needed to fight communism wherever it appeared in that area. Didn't have to declare. There's a misnomer that in Vietnam we declared war on somebody. We never did. We never declared war on anybody. It was just. In fact, you wouldn't even technically call it a war. This resolution got passed by Congress, and it allowed the president complete control over what was going to happen in Vietnam and how many troops he would send over there. And that's what he began to do: send troops, huge numbers of troops over there. Didn't have to declare war to do it. He could send as many troops as he wanted. Fighting in Vietnam was unlike any other war in the history of the United States, and in some ways is very similar to our problems that we had fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. The U.S., of course, had better weapons, had better technology, but the Viet Cong also had many advantages. And here were their advantages. Even though they were peasants, even though they were very poor, they had several advantages. And they were familiar with the land. It was a jungle for the most part, and it was wet all the time. They were familiar with that terrain. They would pop in and out of Vietnam. The neighbors of Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos, they were secret training camps for the Viet Cong and the communists. They would pop in and out, and we had a policy of not chasing them into Cambodia or Laos. And, like I'd already said, the local population began to support them. Everyone hated the government in South Vietnam, so they were perfectly happy to take the medicine, the food, and the supplies, and the order that the Viet Cong brought. Problem was, if you ever crossed the Viet Cong, they would kill you. For American soldiers, they were unsure of who the enemy was. Viet Cong did not wear uniforms. They sort of had an unofficial uniform, but really the Viet Cong could be anybody in a crowded square, could be anybody in the jungle. It was hard to tell a Viet Cong from any other peasant who was working in the fields. The Viet Cong mostly took part in guerrilla attacks, which means little small groups of Viet Cong would sneak up on you at night or sneak up on you in the rain or set booby traps from you, which we'll talk in a second. And they would also sabotage your communications, sabotage your when anyone was trying to resupply you, supply lines. So it made it difficult to move through the jungle with sabotage going on. They also had these insanely elaborate tunnel systems underground where bombing couldn't, or even burning the jungle above them, couldn't kill them because of these systems, which I'll show you in a second. The systems are so elaborate, they actually had running water sometimes. They had electricity. Sometimes they had hospital areas used for mass storage. Here's what they looked like. These would be the underwater or the underground tunnels. They had kitchens. They had areas to sleep, and they were very small, and they were very well camouflaged, as you can see. Here's one in the north. And they used to send these poor soldiers who were small enough to get into these areas down there to clear out the tunnels, which were often booby-trapped as well. So let's talk about those booby traps. For Americans, there was a huge deal with walking through the jungle. Even if you could never see the enemy, you were afraid that while you were on this trail chasing the enemy, there were booby traps set behind you. These punji traps were pits that were filled with spikes or stakes that were often poisoned. These things, these balls with the spikes coming out of them, would be set up in trees, and you trigger them, and they'd fall and smack you right in the face or the chest. Landmines were set all over the place. There's still landmines throughout Vietnam, and they would sometimes these spring-loaded landmines would pop out of the ground and end up about chest level and blow up and take off your arms and send shrapnel into your chest. Wire-rigged grenades were used to take out tanks or to take out men who were marching. So lots of soldiers who fought in Vietnam could easily be injured and sometimes killed, or have their friends injured and killed in front or behind them, and they never would have ever seen an enemy. Some soldiers who were in Vietnam for months never saw the enemy, but may have been injured. For civilians in Vietnam, again, since it's so difficult to tell who was an enemy and who was a civilian, for our soldiers, it got very frustrating. Very, very frustrating. And sometimes they killed civilians out of frustration and anger because they were being shot at or the civilians were hiding the Viet Cong. And the destruction of their villages, the destruction of their fields and their jungle, made the Viet Cong or made the civilians of Vietnam very, very unhappy with the war and unhappy with Americans. The destruction destroyed their homes, destroyed whatever water or electrical services they had coming to their areas, and civilians were killed by mass bombings on a huge scale. So this war that we were fighting in their country for them became very popular with them. Couple of terms you need to know about this war. They had a thing called, we had carpet bombing in World War II. Now, because the bombs are bigger and the planes can carry more of them, they're called saturation bombing, where you can drop thousands of tons of explosives on one targeted area. And we use these new types of bombs called fragmentation bombs, which open up and send little bomblets, little tiny bombs, over a large area, like the graphic there. We used Agent Orange. Agent Orange was used to kill all plant life, so the enemy couldn't hide. Problem was, it was poison. Killed people too. A lot of people who used Agent Orange, even if they were Americans and were using it to fight, became very sick later on and blamed it on Agent Orange. Napalm, which is this jelly that burns, sticks on everything, including humans. Very nasty business. We'll talk about the end of the war and the results of the war in the next lecture.